A pediatric nurse watched two 7-year-old twins dying from carbon monoxide poisoning. The experimental treatment that could save them required breaking every medical protocol she'd sworn to follow. She had 15 minutes to decide. Follow the rules and watch them die, or risk everything to give them a chance. She chose to fight for their lives. 24 hours later, she was unemployed and facing criminal charges. But what happened next would shock the entire medical community and change her life in ways she never imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the pediatric intensive care unit at Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center, casting their familiar, sterile glow across the polished floors. Jessica Rivera moved quietly between the monitors and medical equipment, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the linoleum as she completed her evening rounds. 8 years of working in pediatric intensive care had taught her to read the subtle rhythms of this place. The gentle beeping of heart monitors, the soft whoosh of ventilators, the occasional murmur from worried parents keeping vigil beside. Tiny beds. At 32, Jessica had found her calling among the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. Children fighting for their lives required a special kind of care, one that demanded not just medical expertise, but an almost maternal instinct for what each little patient needed. She had developed a reputation among the staff for her ability to remain calm under pressure while maintaining the kind of gentle bedside manner that could soothe both frightened children and their terrified parents. The winter evening in Denver had settled into its familiar, quiet routine. Outside the large windows that lined the pediatric wing, snow fell steadily from the dark Colorado sky, accumulating on the windowsills and transforming the city below into a winter wonderland. The weather forecast had predicted a significant storm system moving through the area, but inside the hospital, life continued with its measured, careful pace. Jessica paused at the nurse's station to review her patient charts one final time. Her shift was scheduled to end at midnight, and she took pride in ensuring that every detail was perfectly documented for the incoming night staff. Each patient, under her care, had received their medications on schedule. Their vital signs had been monitored and recorded, and their families had been updated on their progress. Room 314 housed a 6-year-old recovering from appendix surgery. Room 316 contained a 9-year-old with severe asthma who was finally breathing easier after 2 days of treatment, and Room 318 held a premature infant who had graduated from the NICU and was gaining strength daily. The pediatric wing operated like a well-orchestrated symphony, with each nurse, doctor, and technician playing their part to create an environment where healing could take place. Jessica appreciated the structured nature of hospital protocols. They existed for good reasons, developed over decades of medical experience to ensure patient safety and optimal outcomes. She had studied these procedures extensively during nursing school and had never once questioned their importance or necessity. Her colleague Kelly Martinez approached the station, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the slightly weary expression that came with a long shift caring for sick children. Kelly had been working in pediatrics for 5 years and had become one of Jessica's closest friends at the hospital. They often covered for each other during breaks and had developed the kind of professional partnership that made even the most challenging days manageable. Room 316 is finally sleeping peacefully, Kelly reported, settling into the chair beside Jessica. His oxygen levels have been stable for the past 4 hours. I think we're going to be able to discharge him tomorrow if everything continues to improve. Jessica smiled, feeling the satisfaction that came with successful treatment. His parents will be so relieved. They've been camping out in that room for 3 days straight. I don't think his mother has left his side for more than 20 minutes at a time. The dedication of parents never ceased to amaze Jessica. She had witnessed countless mothers and fathers who transformed themselves into fierce advocates for their children, learning medical terminology, questioning treatment plans, and refusing to leave the hospital until their little ones were safely on the path to recovery. It was one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking aspects of pediatric nursing, watching families navigate the terrifying experience of having a critically ill child while trying to maintain hope and strength. Kelly nodded knowingly. I keep telling her she needs to rest, but you know how it is. Until that little boy walks out of here completely healthy, she's not going anywhere. She took a sip of her coffee and glanced at the large clock mounted on the wall above the nurse's station. 2 more hours until shift change. It's been relatively quiet tonight, thank goodness. Jessica appreciated the peaceful evening. Quiet nights in pediatric intensive care were a blessing. They meant that children were stable, families could rest, and the medical staff could focus on providing careful, attentive care rather than responding to emergencies. She had learned to never take these calm periods for granted, knowing that the nature of hospital work meant that everything could change in an instant. The hospital's communication system crackled to life overhead, delivering routine announcements about visiting hours and general updates for staff. Jessica barely registered the familiar sounds as she continued reviewing patient charts and preparing detailed notes for the night shift. Documentation was crucial in pediatric care, where even small changes in a child's condition could signal significant developments that required immediate attention. Outside, the snow continued to fall with increasing intensity. The Weather Service had upgraded their winter storm warning, predicting that the Denver area could receive up to 18 inches of snow before morning. Jessica made a mental note to check on the heating systems in the patient rooms. Maintaining proper temperature was especially important for the youngest patients whose bodies struggled to regulate heat effectively. The pediatric wing had been her professional home for nearly a decade, and she knew every corner of this place. She understood which equipment functioned best under specific circumstances, which medications produced the most effective results for different conditions, and which protocols ensured the safest possible outcomes for young patients. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her expertise had been earned through years of dedicated study, countless hours of hands-on experience, and the kind of professional development that came from working alongside some of the most skilled pediatric specialists in Colorado. Dr. Amanda Foster, the head of pediatrics, had often praised Jessica's instinctive understanding of children's needs and her ability to anticipate potential complications before they became serious problems. Just last month, during Jessica's annual performance review, Dr. Foster had noted her exceptional clinical judgment and recommended her for advanced certification in pediatric emergency care. The recognition meant everything to Jessica: validation that her passion for helping children was matched by professional competence and reliability. Kelly stretched and yawned, the long shift beginning to show in her posture. I'm definitely ready for my weekend off. My sister is visiting from California, and we're planning to hit the slopes at Vail if this storm clears up by Saturday. That sounds wonderful, Jessica replied, genuinely happy for her friend. You've been working double shifts for 2 weeks straight. You definitely deserve some time on the mountain. She paused to initial a medication chart and glanced toward the windows, where snow continued to accumulate. Though you might want to keep an eye on this weather situation, the roads could be challenging if the storm doesn't move through quickly. The comfortable routine of their conversation was interrupted by the sudden, sharp buzz of Jessica's pager. She glanced down at the device, expecting to see a routine request from one of her patients or their families. Instead, the message displayed, An emergency code that made her heart rate immediately increase. Emergency department, multiple pediatric trauma, all available ICU staff report. Immediately, Kelly's pager buzzed simultaneously, and both nurses exchanged a look of immediate understanding. Emergency department calls for multiple pediatric trauma were among the most serious situations the hospital could face. Children's bodies responded differently to trauma than adults, and when multiple young patients were involved, it typically meant a serious accident or incident that had affected several families simultaneously. Jessica was already moving before her conscious mind had fully processed the situation. Years of training had conditioned her to respond instantly to emergency calls, and she felt her body shift into the heightened state of alertness that characterized crisis response. Kelly was beside her as they hurried toward the elevator that would take them down to the emergency department, both nurses mentally preparing themselves for whatever situation awaited their arrival. The elevator ride felt simultaneously endless and instantaneous. Jessica's mind raced through the possible scenarios they might encounter. A multi-car accident involving families, a school bus incident, perhaps an apartment fire or carbon monoxide leak that had affected multiple children. Each possibility required different medical interventions and presented unique challenges for pediatric care. Kelly broke the tense silence as the elevator descended. Any idea what we might be dealing with? Jessica shook her head, her professional instincts already cataloging the medical supplies and equipment they might need based on different trauma scenarios. The page just said multiple pediatric trauma. We'll know more when we get there. She paused, then added quietly, whatever it is, we'll handle it. We always do. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and both nurses stepped into a scene that immediately communicated the seriousness of the situation. The emergency department, normally organized and efficiently calm, even during busy periods, showed clear signs of mobilization for a major incident. Additional medical staff were arriving from various departments, emergency equipment was being wheeled into position, and the charge nurse was coordinating assignments with the kind of focused intensity that accompanied life or death situations. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the emergency department's lead pediatric physician, spotted Jessica and Kelly immediately. Her expression was grave as she approached them, carrying a tablet displaying patient information and initial assessments. We have 2 children, 7-year-old twins, carbon monoxide poisoning from a hotel heating system failure downtown. They were found unconscious in their room about 40 minutes ago and have been en route for the past 20 minutes. Jessica felt her stomach tighten as she absorbed the information. Carbon monoxide poisoning in children was particularly dangerous because their smaller bodies process toxins differently than adults, and the effects could be both immediate and long-lasting. The fact that the victims were twins meant they were likely dealing with siblings, which would add emotional complexity to an already medically challenging situation. Dr. Vasquez continued her briefing as they moved toward the trauma bays being prepared for the incoming patients. Initial paramedic reports indicate both children were unconscious when discovered, with cherry-red skin discoloration consistent with carbon monoxide exposure. Their father found them after returning to the hotel room from a business dinner. Hotel management confirms that multiple rooms on the same floor have been evacuated due to a malfunctioning heating unit that was leaking carbon monoxide into the ventilation system. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, signaling the imminent arrival of the ambulances carrying the young patients. Jessica felt her training take over as she mentally reviewed the protocols for carbon monoxide poisoning treatment in pediatric patients. The standard approach involved immediate oxygen therapy, careful monitoring of cardiac function, and assessment for potential complications, including brain damage, depending on the duration and severity of exposure. Kelly moved to help prepare the monitoring equipment, while Jessica assisted with setting up the specialized oxygen delivery systems that would be needed for the twins. The emergency department had transformed into a highly coordinated medical response center, with each team member understanding their role in what was about to unfold. The automatic doors burst open as the first ambulance crew rushed through, pushing a gurney that carried a small figure strapped to the stretcher. Even from a distance, Jessica could see the telltale cherry-red skin color that indicated significant carbon monoxide exposure. The child appeared unconscious, with an oxygen mask covering most of his small face. "This is Ethan Parker, 7 years old," called out Tony Rodriguez, the lead paramedic, as they transferred the boy to the prepared trauma bay. Found unconscious approximately 45 minutes ago. Initial carbon monoxide level measured at 35%. He's been on high flow oxygen since we arrived on scene, but he hasn't regained consciousness. The second ambulance arrived within moments, carrying Ethan's twin sister, Emma. Rachel Kim, the paramedic attending to Emma, provided a similar report as they moved the girl to the adjacent trauma bay. Emma Parker, also 7 years old, found in the same room as her brother. Carbon monoxide level at 38%. She briefly opened her eyes during transport, but hasn't spoken or responded to verbal commands. Jessica found herself assigned to Emma's care team, while Kelly joined the medical professionals working with Ethan. As she looked down at the little girl lying so still on the gurney, Jessica felt the familiar surge of protective instinct that came with caring for pediatric patients. Emma's face was peaceful in unconsciousness, but the unnatural color of her skin told the story of her body's struggle against the invisible poison that had nearly claimed her life. Dr. Vasquez began coordinating the treatment approach for both and children, her voice calm but urgent as she issued orders for immediate interventions. Both patients need continuous high-flow oxygen, cardiac monitoring, and neurological assessments every 15 minutes. I want blood work stat, including carboxyhemoglobin levels and chest x-rays to check for pulmonary complications. The next hour passed in a blur of medical activity as the trauma teams worked to stabilize both twins and assess the full extent of their carbon monoxide exposure. Jessica found herself deeply focused on Emma's care, monitoring vital signs, adjusting oxygen delivery, and watching for any sign that the little girl was responding to treatment. As the evening progressed and the twins' conditions were carefully evaluated, Jessica began to feel cautiously optimistic about their prognosis. Both children were responding well to oxygen therapy. Their carboxyhemoglobin levels were decreasing, and their vital signs remained stable. The swift response by the hotel staff and emergency services, combined with immediate medical intervention, appeared to have prevented the worst possible outcomes. It was just after 11 o'clock when everything changed, transforming what had seemed like a successful rescue into the most challenging decision of Jessica's career. The alarm on Emma's cardiac monitor began beeping with increasing urgency, piercing through the controlled chaos of the emergency department. Jessica's eyes immediately snapped to the display screen, her heart sinking as she watched the 7-year-old's heart rhythm deteriorate from stable to dangerously irregular. The green line that had been tracing steady, reassuring peaks and valleys now showed the erratic pattern of a heart struggling against the effects of carbon monoxide poisoning. "Dr. Vasquez, we have a problem with Emma," Jessica called out, her voice carrying the controlled urgency that every medical professional learned to master during crisis situations. She was already reaching for additional monitoring equipment while keeping her eyes fixed on the little girl's pale face, watching for any other signs of distress. Across the trauma bay, Ethan's condition was following an eerily similar trajectory. Kelly's voice joined Jessica's in reporting deteriorating vital signs as both twins began experiencing the cardiac complications that represented every pediatric medical team's worst nightmare when dealing with carbon monoxide exposure. The poison had infiltrated their small bodies more thoroughly than initial assessments had indicated, and their hearts were now bearing the brunt of the toxic assault. Dr. Vasquez moved swiftly between the two trauma bays, her experienced eyes, taking in the rapidly changing situation with the kind of clinical assessment that came from years of emergency medicine. Both children are entering cardiac distress syndrome secondary to carbon monoxide toxicity. Their oxygen levels are dropping despite maximum ventilation support. The emergency department, which had felt organized and controlled just moments earlier, now pulsed with the heightened energy that accompanied a medical crisis spiraling beyond standard treatment protocols. Additional staff members appeared as if summoned by some invisible signal, wheeling in emergency equipment and preparing for the possibility of advanced cardiac interventions that no medical professional ever wanted to perform on children so young. Jessica found herself working with intense focus as Emma's condition continued to decline. The little girl's skin, which had begun to return to a more normal color during the initial treatment phase, was now taking on a grayish pallor that spoke to her body's increasing struggle to circulate oxygenated blood. Her breathing, assisted by the high-flow oxygen system, became more labored despite the mechanical support. Carbon monoxide levels are still elevated in both patients, reported the laboratory technician who had rushed the blood work results directly to the trauma bay. Emma's at 31% and Ethan's at 29%. Normal treatment protocols aren't reducing the toxin levels fast enough. Dr. Vasquez absorbed this information with the kind of grim understanding that came from recognizing when standard medical procedures were proving insufficient against a particular crisis. Carbon monoxide poisoning in children often presented unique challenges because their smaller body mass meant that the poison could overwhelm their systems more quickly and completely than in adult patients. The sound of additional alarms filled the air as both twins' conditions continued to deteriorate simultaneously. Jessica felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied truly life-threatening medical emergencies, but underneath that physiological response was a growing sense of dread as she watched two young lives hanging in an increasingly precarious balance. Kelly appeared at Jessica's side, her face reflecting the same concern that Jessica felt. Ethan's cardiac function is dropping rapidly. Dr. Vasquez is considering emergency bypass support, but with his current toxin levels, the risks are enormous. Emergency cardiac bypass in pediatric patients was among the most complex and dangerous procedures in modern medicine, requiring a level of surgical intervention that carried significant risks even under ideal circumstances. Attempting such a procedure on children whose bodies were already compromised by severe poisoning represented a desperate measure that spoke to the lack of viable alternatives. Jessica continued monitoring Emma's vital signs while her mind raced through everything she knew about carbon monoxide poisoning treatment. Standard protocols called for high-flow oxygen therapy, supportive cardiac care, and careful monitoring for complications. But those protocols had been developed primarily based on adult patients and less severe exposure cases. The twins were facing a level of toxicity that pushed the boundaries of conventional treatment approaches. There might be another option, Jessica found herself saying, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos surrounding both trauma bays. The words emerged from some deep place in her medical knowledge, a memory of research she had encountered during her advanced pediatric emergency certification coursework. Dr. Vasquez turned toward Jessica with the quick attention that emergency physicians gave to any suggestion during crisis situations. "What are you thinking?" Jessica hesitated for just a moment, knowing that what she was about to propose would challenge every protocol and procedure that governed emergency medical care at Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center. There's an experimental treatment protocol being studied at Johns Hopkins for severe carbon monoxide poisoning in pediatric patients. It involves a specialized antidote compound that can accelerate the elimination of carbon monoxide from hemoglobin. The trauma bay fell into a momentary silence as the implications of Jessica's words settled over the medical team. Experimental. Treatments in emergency situations represented a gray area in medical practice, particularly when dealing with pediatric patients whose legal and ethical protections were especially stringent. Dr. Vasquez's expression showed both interest and concern as she processed the suggestion. I'm familiar with the research you're referencing. The compound has shown promising results in laboratory settings and limited clinical trials, but it hasn't received FDA approval for emergency use. Jessica felt her pulse quicken as she realized that her suggestion had opened a door to a treatment option that could potentially save the twins' lives, but only if the medical team was willing to step outside the carefully defined boundaries of approved medical practice. The research indicates that children with carbon monoxide levels above 30% who don't respond to standard oxygen therapy within 2 hours have a significantly improved survival rate when treated with the experimental compound. The monitors continued their urgent beeping as both twins' conditions showed no sign of improvement despite maximum conventional treatment. Emma's small hand lay motionless on the gurney, her fingers appearing almost translucent under the harsh emergency. Department lighting. Across the trauma bay, Ethan's breathing had become increasingly shallow despite the mechanical assistance. Dr. Vasquez glanced at the large clock mounted on the trauma bay wall, calculating the time that had elapsed since the twins' arrival. We're approaching the 2-hour mark since initial treatment began. Their carbon monoxide levels aren't dropping at the rate we need to see for conventional recovery. Jessica understood the weight of the moment that was unfolding around them. Every medical professional in the trauma bay was acutely aware that they were approaching a critical decision point where conventional treatment protocols might prove insufficient to save the twins' lives. The experimental compound represented hope, but it also represented a departure from established medical practice that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Kelly moved closer to Jessica, her voice low but urgent. Do we even have access to the experimental compound here at the hospital? Jessica nodded slowly, her memory retrieving information from a research presentation she had attended 6 months earlier. Dr. Patricia Wong in our research department was involved in the Johns Hopkins study. She mentioned that a limited supply of the compound was available for emergency research applications. The possibility hung in the air like a lifeline that could only be grasped by abandoning the safety of established procedures. Dr. Vasquez stood between the two trauma bays, her eyes moving from Emma to Ethan as she watched 2 young lives balanced on the edge of a medical precipice that conventional treatment seemed unable to pull them back from. The compound would need to be administered within the next 15 minutes to have optimal effectiveness, Jessica continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was suggesting. After that point, even experimental intervention becomes significantly less likely to reverse the cardiac and neurological effects we're seeing. The 15-minute timeline created an immediate pressure that transformed an already critical situation into a moment of impossible urgency. Dr. Vasquez would need to make a decision that could save the twins' lives or potentially expose them to unknown risks from an experimental treatment that had never been used in their hospital's emergency department. Emergency department protocols at Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center required administrative approval for any experimental treatments, a process that typically involved multiple departments, ethics committee review, and extensive documentation that could take hours or even days to complete. The twins didn't have hours or days. They might not even have the 15 minutes that remained for optimal treatment effectiveness. Jessica watched Emma's face as the little girl's breathing became increasingly labored, despite the maximum oxygen support. 7 years old was far too young to face the kind of medical crisis that was unfolding in the trauma bay. Somewhere in the hospital or perhaps at home, the twins' father was probably receiving updates about his children's condition without fully understanding that conventional medicine was reaching the limits of what it could offer. What are the documented side effects of the experimental compound in pediatric patients? Dr. Vasquez asked, her clinical training demanding a full understanding of the risks, even as time pressure mounted around the decision. Jessica searched. Her memory for the specific research details she had absorbed during the presentation months earlier. The Johns Hopkins study showed minimal adverse reactions in children within the twins' age range. The most significant risk was temporary cardiac rhythm irregularities during the initial administration phase, but those resolved within 20 to 30 minutes in all documented cases. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the trauma bay. The twins were already experiencing severe cardiac rhythm irregularities from the carbon monoxide poisoning, making the potential side effects of the experimental treatment seem relatively minor by comparison. It was a medical calculation that weighed known deterioration against unknown but promising intervention. Dr. Vasquez made a decision that would echo through the remainder of the evening and far beyond. Contact Dr. Wong immediately. Tell her we need emergency access to the experimental compound for 2 pediatric patients with severe carbon monoxide poisoning. I'll take responsibility for the protocol deviation. Jessica felt a surge of relief, mixed with apprehension, as she realized that the twins would have a chance at the potentially life-saving treatment. But she also understood that Dr. Vasquez was placing her career and reputation at risk by authorizing the use of an experimental compound without following established approval procedures. Kelly was already reaching for the phone to contact Dr. Wong, while Jessica continued monitoring Emma's deteriorating vital signs. The next 15 minutes would determine whether the experimental treatment could reverse the twins' declining condition, or whether they would continue to slip away despite every medical intervention available. The trauma bay filled with new urgency as additional staff members arrived to assist with the experimental treatment preparation. Dr. Wong appeared within minutes, carrying a small, carefully labeled vial that contained the compound that might save the twins' lives. Her expression reflected both professional excitement about the potential application of her research and deep concern about using an experimental treatment in such a critical emergency situation. The compound needs to be administered intravenously over a period of exactly 8 minutes, Dr. Wong explained to the medical team as they prepared for the unprecedented intervention. We'll need continuous cardiac monitoring throughout the administration and for at least 1 hour afterward. Jessica found herself designated as the primary nurse for Emma's treatment, while Kelly took responsibility for Ethan's care. As she prepared the specialized IV equipment needed for the experimental compound administration, Jessica felt the weight of the moment settling around her. This wasn't just another medical procedure, it was a leap into uncharted territory that could either save 2 young lives or create complications that no one fully understood. The vial containing the experimental compound seemed impossibly small to hold such enormous potential. Dr. Wong carefully calculated the precise dosages needed for each twin based on their body weight and current carbon monoxide levels. Her movements, deliberate and methodical, despite the time pressure that surrounded them. Both children will receive the compound simultaneously, Dr. Wong announced to the medical team. "We need to monitor for any signs of adverse reaction, particularly cardiac irregularities beyond what they're already experiencing." Jessica inserted the specialized IV line into Emma's small arm with the kind of gentle precision that years of pediatric nursing had taught her. The little girl didn't respond to the procedure, her unconscious state a stark reminder of how severely the carbon monoxide had affected her neurological function. As the experimental compound began flowing into Emma's bloodstream, Jessica felt herself holding her breath while watching the cardiac monitor for any sign of how the little girl's body would respond to the treatment. The green line on the screen continued its erratic pattern, but within minutes, Jessica began to notice subtle changes that suggested the compound was beginning to interact with the carbon monoxide in Emma's system. Across the trauma bay, Kelly was reporting similar observations as Ethan received his dose of the experimental treatment. Both twins remained unconscious, but their cardiac rhythms showed the first signs of stabilization that the medical team had seen since the crisis had escalated. Dr. Vasquez moved between the trauma bays, her experienced eyes monitoring both children's responses to the experimental intervention. Initial indications are positive. We're seeing modest improvement in cardiac function for both patients. The 8-minute administration period felt simultaneously endless and instantaneous, as Jessica maintained constant vigilance over Emma's vital signs. The experimental compound represented hope, but it also represented a medical gamble that could have consequences extending far beyond the immediate emergency. As the treatment reached completion, Jessica found herself watching Emma's face with intense focus, looking for any sign that the little girl was beginning to respond to the intervention. The cherry-red coloration that had marked severe carbon monoxide poisoning was gradually giving way to a more natural skin tone, suggesting that the compound was successfully facilitating the elimination of the toxin from her bloodstream. Kelly's voice carried cautious optimism as she reported on Ethan's condition. His oxygen saturation is improving, and the cardiac irregularities are becoming less frequent. The experimental treatment had been administered successfully, but the next several hours would determine whether Jessica's suggestion and Dr. Vasquez's decision to authorize the protocol deviation would result in the twins' recovery or create new complications that conventional medicine would struggle to address. Jessica remained at Emma's side as the little girl's condition continued to stabilize gradually. The experimental compound appeared to be working exactly as the Johns Hopkins research had predicted, offering hope that both twins would survive their encounter with the invisible poison that had nearly claimed their lives. But even as Jessica felt cautious optimism about the twins' medical prognosis, she understood that the decision to use experimental treatment without proper authorization would likely have consequences that extended far beyond the emergency department. Protocol deviations in pediatric care were taken seriously by hospital administration, and the use of an unapproved compound in life-threatening situations would certainly trigger investigations and reviews that could affect everyone involved in the decision. For now, though, Jessica focused entirely on Emma's continued recovery, watching as the little girl's vital signs showed steady improvement that suggested the experimental treatment was successfully reversing the effects of carbon monoxide poisoning. The decision to break protocol had been made, the intervention had been administered, and the twins appeared to be responding positively to the treatment that conventional medicine couldn't provide. The most immediate crisis was passing, but Jessica had no way of knowing that the consequences of saving the twins' lives would soon transform her own life in ways she had never imagined possible. 3 hours after the experimental compound had been administered, both Emma and Ethan Parker showed remarkable improvement in all measured vital signs. Emma had begun responding to verbal stimuli, though she remained largely unconscious, while Ethan had opened his eyes briefly and seemed to recognize his surroundings, despite his continued confusion and weakness. Dr. Wong remained in the emergency department throughout the night, documenting every aspect of the twins' response to the experimental treatment. Her research background made her acutely aware that this emergency application represented valuable data for the ongoing study of carbon monoxide poisoning interventions, but her immediate concern focused entirely on ensuring that both children continued their positive recovery trajectory. Jessica felt exhaustion settling into her bones as the adrenaline that had sustained her through the medical crisis began to ebb. The pediatric intensive care unit seemed like a distant memory, even though only hours had passed since she had been completing her routine evening rounds in that familiar, controlled environment. Kelly approached Jessica as the first hints of dawn began to appear through the emergency department windows. The twins are stable enough for transfer to pediatric ICU. Dr. Vasquez wants both children under continuous monitoring for the next 48 hours to ensure there are no delayed reactions to the experimental compound. The successful stabilization of Emma and Ethan represented a victory for experimental medicine and innovative thinking in emergency situations. But Jessica understood that the celebration would be short-lived. Hospital protocols existed for important reasons, and the decision to circumvent established procedures would inevitably trigger administrative review and potential disciplinary action. Dr. Vasquez appeared at Jessica's side as the twins were being prepared for transfer to the intensive care unit. Her expression showed both satisfaction with the medical outcome and concern about the professional implications of the night's events. Jessica, I want you to know that your suggestion about the experimental compound was the key factor in saving these children's lives. Without your knowledge of the research and willingness to propose an unconventional solution, we would have been limited to supportive care that might not have been sufficient. Jessica appreciated the recognition, but she also sensed the underlying tension in Dr. Vasquez's words. Medical professionals who deviated from established protocols, even with successful outcomes, often faced scrutiny from hospital administrators who prioritized institutional liability over individual clinical decisions. As Emma and Ethan were wheeled toward the elevators that would carry them to the pediatric intensive care unit, Jessica caught a glimpse of their father for the first time. Michael Parker stood near the registration desk, his face showing the strain of a night spent waiting for news about his children's condition. His expensive business suit was rumpled from hours of worry, and his eyes carried the haunted expression of a parent who had come dangerously close to losing everything that mattered most to him. Jessica wondered what Michael Parker knew about the experimental treatment that had likely saved his children's lives, and whether he understood that the medical team had been forced to venture beyond approved protocols to give Emma and Ethan their best chance at recovery. The emergency department began returning to its normal rhythm as the immediate crisis passed and the twins were transferred to ongoing care. Jessica completed the extensive documentation required for any protocol deviation, carefully recording every detail of the experimental treatment administration and the children's positive response. Dr. Wong approached Jessica as she finished her paperwork, her expression reflecting both professional gratitude and concern about the broader implications of the night's events. I want to thank you for remembering the research about the experimental compound. Your suggestion created an opportunity to save 2 young lives. But I need you to understand that using an unapproved treatment in an emergency situation will definitely trigger administrative review. Jessica nodded, understanding that her decision to suggest the experimental treatment had set in motion a series of events that would extend far beyond the successful medical outcome. Hospital administrators would need to investigate the protocol deviation, ethics committees would review the decision-making process, and regulatory agencies might become involved if the experimental treatment application was reported as required by federal guidelines. The immediate satisfaction of successful patient care was beginning to give way to apprehension about the professional consequences that would likely follow. Jessica had spent 8 years building her reputation as a skilled and reliable pediatric nurse, and she understood that protocol deviations could result in disciplinary action ranging from formal reprimands to termination of employment. Kelly remained with Jessica as they completed their shift documentation and prepared to leave the hospital as the morning staff arrived for the day shift. "You did the right thing," Kelly said quietly. "Those children are alive because you remembered the research about the experimental compound and had the courage to suggest it when conventional treatment wasn't working." Jessica appreciated her friend's support, but she also understood that doing the right thing in medical situations didn't always protect healthcare professionals from institutional consequences. Hospital administrators operated under different pressures than medical staff, focusing on liability management and regulatory compliance rather than individual patient outcomes. The drive home through Denver's snow-covered streets gave Jessica time to process the events of the night and consider what the next few days might bring. She felt confident that the experimental treatment had been the correct medical decision under the circumstances, but she also understood that her career at Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center might face serious challenges as a result of the protocol deviation. As Jessica pulled into the parking lot of her Capitol Hill apartment building, she caught sight of the morning news van parked across the street. The hotel carbon monoxide incident had apparently attracted media attention, though she assumed the coverage would focus on the environmental failure that had endangered multiple families rather than the specific medical treatments that had saved the twins' lives. She made her way up to her second-floor apartment, feeling the exhaustion that always followed particularly intense shifts in pediatric emergency medicine. The successful treatment of Emma and Ethan Parker represented one of the most challenging and rewarding experiences of her nursing career, but it had also placed her in a position where her professional future was suddenly uncertain. Jessica's apartment felt like a sanctuary after the intensity of the hospital environment. She made herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite chair near the window that looked out over the snow-covered neighborhood. The peaceful morning scene contrasted sharply with the life-and-death drama that had unfolded in the emergency department just hours earlier. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Kelly. "Heard that hospital administration wants to meet with everyone involved in the experimental treatment decision scheduled for Monday morning. Just wanted to give you a heads up." Jessica stared at the message, feeling her stomach tighten as she realized that the professional consequences of the night's events were already beginning to unfold. Monday morning meetings with hospital administration rarely resulted in positive outcomes for staff members who had deviated from established protocols, regardless of the medical success of their decisions. She spent the remainder of Saturday trying to rest and prepare mentally for what would likely be a challenging week ahead. The twins' successful recovery should have been a cause for celebration, but instead, Jessica found herself contemplating the possibility that saving their lives might cost her the career she had worked so hard to build. Sunday passed quietly, with periodic updates from colleagues about the twins' continued improvement and growing speculation about the hospital's response to the experimental treatment decision. Jessica tried to focus on routine activities and personal interests, but Her mind kept returning to the upcoming administrative meeting and its potential implications for her future in pediatric nursing. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and bitter cold temperatures that made Denver feel more like an Arctic outpost than a major metropolitan area. Jessica dressed carefully for the hospital meeting, choosing professional attire that conveyed competence and responsibility while trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The administrative conference room at Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center felt imposing and formal, with its polished table and formal seating arrangements that emphasized the institutional nature of the proceedings. Dr. Robert Whitman, the hospital's chief administrator, sat at the head of the table, flanked by representatives from Human Resources, Legal Affairs, and the Ethics Committee. Dr. Vasquez was present as the attending physician who had authorized the experimental treatment, along with Dr. Wong as the researcher who had provided the compound and expertise. Jessica took her designated seat, feeling the weight of institutional scrutiny settling around her like an uncomfortable garment. Dr. Whitman opened the meeting with a summary of the weekend's events that focused primarily on the protocol deviation and its implications for hospital liability rather than the successful medical outcome. We're here to review the decision to administer an unapproved experimental compound to 2 pediatric patients without following established authorization procedures. Jessica listened as the administrative perspective on the twins' treatment was presented in terms of regulatory compliance, institutional liability, and procedural violations, rather than life-saving medical intervention. The disconnect between the clinical reality of emergency medicine and the administrative concerns of hospital management became starkly apparent as the meeting progressed. Dr. Vasquez defended the medical team's decisions with the passion and expertise that had made her one of the most respected emergency physicians in Colorado. The experimental compound was the only viable option for preventing permanent neurological damage or death in both patients. Conventional treatment protocols were proving insufficient, and we faced a narrow window for effective intervention. The legal representative raised concerns about potential liability exposure from using an unapproved treatment, while the ethics committee representative questioned whether proper informed consent procedures had been followed given the emergency circumstances and the twins' unconscious state. Jessica found herself asked to explain her knowledge of the experimental compound research and her decision to suggest its use during the medical crisis. She presented her reasoning clearly and professionally, emphasizing the research data that had indicated the treatment's potential effectiveness for severe carbon monoxide poisoning in pediatric patients. The meeting continued for over 2 hours, with detailed examination of every aspect of the experimental treatment decision and its implementation. Jessica began to sense that the administrative review was moving toward conclusions that prioritized institutional protection over recognition of successful patient care. Dr. Whitman's closing statements confirmed Jessica's growing apprehension about the meeting's direction. While we acknowledge that the patient's recovery is obviously a positive outcome, the decision to use an experimental treatment without proper authorization represents a serious deviation from established protocols that ensure patient safety and institutional compliance with federal regulations. Jessica left the meeting understanding that her suggestion to use the experimental compound, despite its role in saving the twins' lives, had placed her in a position where disciplinary action was not only possible but likely. The hospital's priority appeared to be protecting itself from potential regulatory consequences rather than celebrating innovative thinking that had prevented 2 young deaths. The next morning, Jessica received a call asking her to report to Human Resources for a follow-up meeting regarding the experimental treatment incident. She understood that this second meeting would likely focus on her individual role in the protocol deviation and its consequences for her employment at Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center, as she prepared for what could potentially be her final meeting as a hospital employee. Jessica reflected on the events that had led to this moment. She felt no regret about suggesting the experimental treatment that had saved Emma and Ethan Parker's lives, but she also understood that doing the right thing in emergency situations sometimes came with professional costs that extended far beyond the immediate medical crisis. The Human Resources conference room felt sterile and unwelcoming as Jessica sat across from Linda Chen, the hospital's HR director, and Marcus Thompson, the security chief. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the polished table, creating an atmosphere that seemed designed to intimidate rather than facilitate productive discussion. Jessica had arrived 15 minutes early for the meeting, hoping to project professionalism and cooperation, despite her growing certainty about the meeting's likely outcome. Linda Chen opened a thick folder containing documentation from the weekend's events, her expression neutral but businesslike as she reviewed the paperwork that would determine Jessica's professional future. "Ms. Rivera, we're here to discuss your role in the experimental treatment incident involving the Parker twins. Specifically, we need to address your suggestion to use an unapproved medical compound without following established authorization protocols." Jessica maintained eye contact as she responded, drawing on 8 years of experience in difficult conversations with families facing medical crises. "I suggested the experimental treatment because conventional protocols weren't effectively reducing the twins' carbon monoxide levels, and their cardiac function was deteriorating rapidly. The research I was familiar with indicated that the compound could prevent permanent neurological damage or death." Marcus Thompson consulted his notes as he spoke, his voice carrying the formal tone that characterized institutional disciplinary proceedings. According to Hospital Policy Section 12.4.7, any experimental treatment recommendations must be submitted through the Research Committee for review and approval before implementation. This process typically requires between 72 and 96 hours for completion. The absurdity of applying a 72-hour approval process to a 15-minute medical emergency wasn't lost on Jessica, but she understood that hospital administrators operated within different frameworks than emergency medical professionals. The twins didn't have 72 hours. They had 15 minutes before the window for effective intervention would close permanently. Linda Chen made notes in the margin of the documentation as she continued the questioning. "We understand that emergency situations create time pressures, but hospital policies exist to protect both patients and staff from the risks associated with unapproved treatments. Your suggestion to use an experimental compound placed the hospital in a position of potential liability." Jessica felt frustration building as the conversation focused on institutional liability rather than the successful preservation of 2 young lives. "The twins are alive and recovering because we used the experimental compound. Conventional treatment was failing, and waiting for approval would have resulted in permanent neurological damage or death." The meeting continued for another hour with detailed examination of Jessica's decision-making process and her familiarity with the experimental treatment research. Jessica answered every question honestly and thoroughly, but she began to sense that the outcome had been predetermined before she entered the room. Marcus Thompson delivered the conclusion with the kind of formal language that characterized administrative decisions designed to minimize legal exposure. "After careful review of the incident and consultation with hospital legal counsel, we've determined that your suggestion to use an experimental treatment without proper authorization represents a serious violation of hospital protocols that cannot be overlooked, regardless of the positive patient outcome. Jessica felt her stomach drop as she realized that her 8-year career at Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center was about to end because she had helped save 2 children's lives. Are you saying that successfully treating the twins is less important than following administrative procedures? Linda Chen's response reflected the institutional priorities that governed hospital decision-making in an era of increasing regulatory oversight and liability concerns. We're saying that patient safety requires adherence to established protocols, and individual staff members cannot be permitted to make independent decisions about experimental treatments, even in emergency situations. The termination paperwork was already prepared, suggesting that the meeting had been a formality rather than a genuine review of the circumstances surrounding the experimental treatment decision. Jessica signed the required documents with a steady hand, maintaining her composure despite the devastating blow to her professional identity and financial security. Marcus Thompson escorted Jessica to her locker in the staff area, where she gathered her personal belongings under the watchful supervision of hospital security. The institutional nature of her departure felt surreal after 8 years of dedicated service to pediatric patients and their families. Kelly appeared in the hallway as Jessica was leaving the hospital for the final time, her expression reflecting the shock and outrage that many staff members felt about the administration's decision. "This is completely wrong, Jessica. Everyone in the emergency department knows that you saved those children's lives." Jessica appreciated her friend's support, but she also understood that the hospital's decision reflected broader trends in healthcare administration that prioritized regulatory compliance over individual clinical judgment. "Take care of yourself, Kelly. Keep fighting for the kids." The walk to her car through the hospital parking lot felt like a journey through a landscape that had suddenly become foreign and unwelcoming. The pediatric wing, where she had spent countless hours caring for sick children, was visible through the windows, but it now represented a chapter of her life that had closed permanently. Jessica drove home through Denver's midday traffic, processing the reality of her sudden unemployment and the uncertain future that stretched ahead. The successful treatment of Emma and Ethan Parker had cost her everything she had worked to build, professionally, but she felt no regret about the decision that had saved their lives. The local news coverage of the hotel carbon monoxide incident had mentioned the twins' recovery without providing details about the experimental treatment that had made their survival possible. Jessica realized that the public would never know about the medical innovation and protocol violations that had prevented 2 young deaths. Her apartment felt different when she returned that afternoon, no longer a refuge between hospital shifts, but a place where she would need to figure out how to rebuild her career and financial stability. The nursing profession offered opportunities beyond hospital employment, but Jessica's specialized experience in pediatric intensive care had been specifically developed for the institutional environment she had just been forced to leave. Over the next several days, Jessica began the process of applying for nursing positions at other healthcare facilities throughout the Denver metropolitan area. The termination from Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center would require explanation during job interviews, and she understood that her involvement in experimental treatment without authorization might limit her employment opportunities. Kelly called regularly with updates about the twins' continued recovery and the ongoing discussions among hospital staff about Jessica's termination. The nursing staff in pediatrics had been particularly vocal about their disagreement with the administration's decision, but institutional policies remained unchanged despite the successful patient outcome. A week after her termination, Jessica received an unexpected call from Dr. Patricia Wong, the researcher who had provided the experimental compound during the medical emergency. Jessica, I wanted you to know that the twins' recovery has provided valuable data for our research, and your suggestion to use the compound in an emergency situation has contributed significantly to our understanding of its potential applications. Dr. Wong's recognition meant more to Jessica than the hospital administration's disciplinary action, but it didn't address the practical challenges of unemployment and career disruption that she now faced. I'm glad the twins' case can help. Advance the research. They deserved every chance we could give them. The conversation with Dr. Wong revealed that the experimental treatment success with Emma and Ethan Parker had attracted attention from medical researchers across the country who were studying carbon monoxide poisoning interventions. Jessica's clinical knowledge and quick thinking during the emergency had played a crucial role in what might become a breakthrough in pediatric emergency medicine. As Jessica continued her job search, she found herself repeatedly explaining the circumstances of her termination to potential employers who expressed concern about hiring a nurse who had been dismissed for protocol violations. The context of successfully saving 2 children's lives seemed less important to hiring managers than the fact that she had been terminated for not following established procedures. The financial pressure of unemployment added stress to the emotional toll of losing her career in pediatric nursing. Jessica had always lived modestly on her hospital salary, but the loss of income forced her to consider alternatives to the specialized nursing career she had spent years developing. 2 weeks after her termination, Jessica was working on yet another job application when her doorbell rang unexpectedly. She wasn't expecting any visitors and rarely received deliveries that required personal interaction. When she opened the door, she found a well-dressed man in his 40s standing in the hallway, his expensive suit and confident demeanor suggesting someone accustomed to positions of authority and influence. "Ms. Rivera, my name is Michael Parker. I'm Emma and Ethan's father." His voice carried a warmth that contrasted with his formal appearance, and his eyes showed the kind of emotional depth that came from recent experience with nearly losing everything that mattered most. Jessica felt her breath catch as she realized she was meeting the man whose children she had helped save, the father who had nearly lost his twins to carbon monoxide poisoning. "Mr. Parker, how are Emma and Ethan doing?" Michael's face lit up with genuine joy as he spoke about his children's recovery. "They're doing wonderfully. Completely recovered, no neurological effects, full energy and back to driving me crazy with their questions about everything." His expression grew more serious as he continued. "I'm here because I found out what happened to you after you saved their lives." Jessica invited Michael into her apartment, suddenly conscious of the modest surroundings compared to what was likely his usual environment. "Would you like some coffee? I was just working on some job applications." Michael declined the coffee, but accepted the invitation to sit in her small living room, his presence somehow making the space feel even more compact. "Ms. Rivera, I want you to know that I've spent the past 2 weeks learning everything I can about what happened in the emergency department the night my children were brought in." Jessica settled into her chair across from Michael, uncertain about where the conversation was heading, but grateful for the opportunity to meet the man whose children had inadvertently changed the course of her career. "I'm glad they're doing well. That's all that really matters." Michael leaned forward, his expression intense and focused, as he began to share what he had discovered about the medical treatment that had saved his children's lives. "I know about the experimental compound. I know that conventional treatment wasn't working, and that you suggested an alternative that required breaking hospital protocols. I also know that you were fired for making the suggestion that saved Emma and Ethan's lives." The weight of Michael's knowledge about the circumstances surrounding her termination felt both validating and overwhelming. Jessica had grown accustomed to explaining the situation in clinical terms during job interviews, but hearing it described by someone whose children had benefited from her decision created an entirely different emotional context. Michael continued, speaking with the kind of controlled passion that suggested someone who had spent considerable time thinking about injustice and appropriate responses. What happened to you is wrong on every level I can think of. You saved my children's lives, and the hospital punished you for it. That's not acceptable. Jessica appreciated Michael's outrage on her behalf, but she also understood the practical realities of hospital administration and regulatory compliance that had driven the decision to terminate her employment. The hospital was protecting itself from potential liability. I understood the risks when I suggested the experimental treatment. Michael's response revealed both his business background and his personal investment in ensuring that Jessica's sacrifice wasn't forgotten or unrewarded. I've spent 2 weeks investigating this situation, and I want you to know that I have resources and connections that can help address what happened to you. The conversation that followed transformed Jessica's understanding of her situation and opened possibilities that she had never imagined during the weeks of job searching and financial anxiety that had followed her termination. Michael Parker was not just a grateful parent. He was someone with the means and motivation to create meaningful change in response to the injustice he had discovered. Michael explained that his background in real estate development had given him experience with regulatory systems and institutional politics, along with financial resources that could support innovative approaches to problems that seemed intractable through conventional channels. I want to offer you something that goes beyond just finding another nursing job. Jessica listened with growing amazement as Michael outlined a vision for addressing the systemic issues that had led to her termination while creating opportunities for medical professionals who faced similar situations. His proposal involved resources and possibilities that far exceeded anything she could have imagined during her darkest moments of unemployment and career uncertainty. The meeting with Michael Parker lasted for over 3 hours as they discussed not only Jessica's immediate situation, but also broader questions about medical innovation, institutional resistance to change, and the need for support systems that protected healthcare professionals who took calculated risks to save lives. As Michael prepared to leave, he handed Jessica a business card with his personal contact information and a brief handwritten note. Think about what we've discussed. I'll call you in a few days to see if you're interested in moving forward with some of the ideas we've talked about. After Michael left, Jessica sat in her living room holding his business card and trying to process the dramatic shift that had just occurred in her understanding of her situation. The chance encounter with the father of the children she had helped save had opened doors to possibilities that seemed almost too good to be true. The handwritten note on the back of Michael's business card was simple but powerful. Thank you for giving me my children back. Now let me help give you back your future. Jessica stared at the words for a long time, beginning to believe that her decision to suggest experimental treatment might lead to opportunities rather than just consequences. That evening, Jessica called Kelly to share the unexpected development and seek advice about Michael Parker's proposals. Kelly's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Jessica, this could be exactly what you need, and more importantly, it could help other nurses who face similar situations in the future. The conversation with Kelly helped Jessica process the emotional whiplash of moving from unemployment and career uncertainty to unexpected opportunities for meaningful change. Michael Parker's offer represented more than just personal rescue. It suggested the possibility of addressing systemic problems that affected medical professionals throughout the healthcare system. Over the next few days, Jessica found herself researching Michael Parker's background and business history, trying to understand the resources and connections that had enabled him to make such ambitious proposals during their initial meeting. What she discovered confirmed that he possessed both the financial means and professional network necessary to support the kind of innovative initiatives he had described. Michael's real estate development company had been involved in several major healthcare facility projects throughout Colorado, giving him extensive experience with medical system operations and regulatory requirements. His personal wealth, accumulated through decades of successful business ventures, positioned him to fund initiatives that could create meaningful change rather than just addressing individual cases of injustice. When Michael called 3 days later to follow up on their conversation, Jessica was prepared to engage seriously with his proposals. "I've been thinking about everything we discussed, and I'm interested in learning more about how we might move forward." Michael's enthusiasm was evident as he outlined specific steps they could take to address both Jessica's immediate situation and the broader systemic issues that had led to her termination. "I think we can create something that not only helps you, but also prevents other medical professionals from facing similar consequences for making life-saving decisions." The foundation of what would become a major initiative in healthcare advocacy began with that phone call, as Jessica and Michael started planning an approach to medical innovation and professional protection that would eventually attract national attention and support from medical professionals across the country. Jessica's unexpected termination for saving 2 children's lives had seemed like the end of her nursing career. But Michael Parker's intervention was transforming it into the beginning of something much larger and more significant than she had ever imagined possible. As she prepared for another meeting with Michael to discuss specific implementation strategies, Jessica realized that her decision to suggest experimental treatment during a medical emergency had set in motion a series of events that would extend far beyond her personal career recovery. The twins she had helped save were about to become the catalyst for changes that could benefit countless medical professionals and patients in the future. The injustice that had seemed so devastating just weeks earlier was beginning to reveal itself as the foundation for opportunities to create systematic improvements in how the medical system responded to innovation and calculated risk-taking in emergency situations. Jessica's courage during 15 minutes of medical crisis was about to generate consequences that would last for years and help transform healthcare policy across the nation. The intimate setting of the Paramount Cafe provided a stark contrast to the institutional conference rooms where Jessica had recently faced professional destruction. Michael Parker had chosen a quiet corner table overlooking the 16th Street Mall, where the gentle sounds of conversation and clinking coffee cups created an atmosphere conducive to meaningful discussion rather than formal interrogation. When Jessica arrived precisely on time, she found Michael already seated with Emma and Ethan, both children displaying the vibrant energy that testified to their complete recovery from the carbon monoxide poisoning that had nearly claimed their lives. Emma looked up from her coloring book as Jessica approached their table, her bright eyes immediately recognizing the woman who had played such a crucial role in saving her life. "Daddy, is that the nurse who helped us at the hospital?" The 7-year-old's voice carried the innocent directness that characterized children's observations about the adult world around them. Ethan, equally recovered and energetic, bounded from his chair to greet Jessica with the kind of uninhibited enthusiasm that only children could display. "Are you Jessica? Daddy said you're the one who made sure we got better when we were really sick." his small arms wrapped around Jessica's waist in a spontaneous hug that conveyed more gratitude than any formal expression of appreciation could have achieved. Jessica knelt down to meet both children at their eye level, feeling the profound, emotional impact of seeing Emma and Ethan healthy and thriving. The last time she had seen them, they had been unconscious and fighting for their lives against the invisible poison that had invaded their small bodies. Now, they were vibrant, curious, and completely unaware of how close they had come to never experiencing another day. Michael stood as Jessica straightened, his expression reflecting the deep gratitude and determination that had driven him to seek her out and learn the truth about what had happened after his children's lives had been
saved.
Jessica, I can't thank you enough for agreeing to meet with us. Emma and Ethan have been asking about you ever since they learned that you were the nurse who helped them during their emergency. The cafe setting allowed for a conversation that felt personal and meaningful rather than clinical or administrative. Michael had clearly chosen this environment to create space for genuine human connection, rather than the kind of formal discussion that had characterized Jessica's recent encounters with hospital administration. As they settled into their seats, Jessica found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Emma pulled a carefully folded piece of paper from her small backpack, her movements deliberate and serious as she prepared to share something important. I drew this picture for you at the hospital, but Daddy said we had to wait to find you before I could give it to you. She unfolded the drawing to reveal a colorful depiction of stick figures in what appeared to be a hospital room, with one larger figure wearing what was clearly meant to represent a nurse's uniform. The artwork, created with the enthusiastic imprecision that characterized 7-year-old artistic expression, showed Jessica caring for both twins during their medical crisis. Emma had somehow captured the essential elements of the emergency department experience despite being unconscious for most of her treatment. That's you, helping me and Ethan get better, she explained, with the matter-of-fact tone that children used when describing complex emotional situations. Ethan contributed his own perspective as he showed Jessica a small toy ambulance that he'd been carrying. This is like the one that brought us to the hospital. Daddy explained that you knew special medicine that could help us when the regular medicine wasn't working good enough. His childlike pronunciation of medical concepts somehow made the experimental treatment decision seem both simple and profound. Michael watched his children interact with Jessica, his expression reflecting both amazement at their complete recovery and determination to address the injustice that had followed their successful treatment. They understand that you did something special to help them get better, and they've been wanting to thank you personally ever since they learned about your role in their recovery. The conversation that followed allowed Jessica to see the human impact of her medical decision from an entirely different perspective than the clinical documentation and administrative review that had dominated her experience since the experimental treatment. Emma and Ethan were living proof that her suggestion to use the unapproved compound had prevented tragedy and preserved 2 young lives that were now filled with normal childhood activities and experiences. Michael began explaining the investigation he had conducted into the circumstances surrounding Jessica's termination, his business background having provided him with the skills and connections necessary to understand the institutional dynamics that had led to her punishment for successful patient care. I've spent considerable time learning about hospital protocols, medical liability, and the regulatory environment that creates situations where saving lives can result in professional consequences. The depth of Michael's research impressed Jessica as he detailed his understanding of the experimental compound, the research supporting its use, and the administrative pressures that had driven Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center to prioritize procedural compliance over innovative medical intervention. His analysis went far beyond grateful parent appreciation to encompass systemic issues that affected healthcare delivery throughout the industry. Michael's business experience had taught him to identify problems that required comprehensive solutions rather than individual responses. And his investigation had revealed that Jessica's situation represented a broader pattern of institutional resistance to medical innovation and calculated risk-taking that could benefit patients in emergency situations. Your case isn't unique, Jessica. Medical professionals across the country face similar consequences when they make decisions that prioritize patient outcomes over administrative procedures. As their conversation progressed, Michael outlined a vision for addressing the systemic issues that had led to Jessica's termination, while creating support structures for medical professionals who faced similar situations in the future. His proposal involved financial resources, legal advocacy, and institutional partnerships that could transform how the healthcare system responded to innovation and emergency decision-making. The scope of Michael's vision extended far beyond simply helping Jessica recover from her employment termination. He envisioned creating a foundation that could provide legal support for medical professionals facing disciplinary action for innovative patient care, fund research into experimental treatments that showed promise for emergency situations, and advocate for policy changes that would protect healthcare workers who took calculated risks to save lives. Michael pulled out a leather portfolio containing detailed documentation of his preliminary research and planning for what he was proposing to call the Parker Foundation for Medical Innovation. I want to offer you the opportunity to lead this initiative, Jessica. Your clinical expertise, combined with your first-hand experience of the consequences that medical professionals face for innovative thinking, makes you the ideal person to direct our efforts. The foundation concept that Michael described represented opportunities that Jessica had never imagined possible during her weeks of unemployment and career uncertainty. Rather than simply finding another nursing position where she would face the same institutional constraints that had led to her termination, she would have the chance to create systematic change that could benefit countless medical professionals and patients. Michael continued explaining the Foundation's proposed structure and funding, revealing financial resources that reflected his successful business career and personal commitment to addressing the injustice he had discovered. I'm prepared to provide $50 million in initial funding, with additional resources available as the Foundation's work expands and demonstrates impact. The magnitude of Michael's financial commitment took Jessica's breath away as she realized the scope of what he was proposing. $50 million could fund legal advocacy, research initiatives, educational programs, and policy development efforts that could transform how the healthcare system approached medical innovation and emergency decision-making. Emma and Ethan had been coloring quietly during their father's detailed explanation, but they looked up as they sensed the significance of the conversation unfolding around them. Emma approached Jessica's chair and took her hand with the simple directness that characterized children's responses to important moments. Are you going to help other people like you helped us? The question, posed with 7-year-old clarity, captured the essential purpose of what Michael was proposing better than any sophisticated mission statement could have achieved. Jessica looked down at Emma's trusting face and felt a sense of purpose and possibility that had been missing since her termination from the hospital. Michael's proposal offered Jessica the chance to transform her experience of professional injustice into a platform for creating meaningful change that could prevent similar situations from affecting other medical professionals. The Foundation would provide resources and support that could empower healthcare workers to make innovative decisions without fear of career-ending consequences. As Jessica considered the implications of Michael's offer, she realized that accepting would mean leaving behind her identity as a hospital-based pediatric nurse and embracing a role as an advocate and leader in healthcare policy development. The transition represented both opportunity and risk, requiring her to move beyond familiar clinical environments into areas of law, policy, and institutional change. Michael seemed to understand Jessica's need to process the magnitude of what he was proposing, and he offered to provide additional time for consideration while assuring her that his commitment to addressing the injustice remained firm, regardless of her decision. "Take whatever time you need to think about this, Jessica. I'll support your decision either way, but I hope you'll consider the impact we could have working together." The meeting concluded with arrangements for follow-up conversations and Jessica's agreement to seriously consider Michael's proposal over the following week. As they prepared to leave the cafe, both Emma and Ethan hugged Jessica again, their simple expressions of affection providing powerful motivation for accepting the opportunity to create change that could benefit other families facing medical emergencies. Walking back to her car after the meeting, Jessica felt a sense of possibility that had been absent since her termination from Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center. Michael Parker's proposal offered not just personal recovery from professional setback, but the chance to create systematic improvements that could benefit the entire healthcare system. Over the following week, Jessica researched foundation management, healthcare advocacy, and medical policy development, trying to understand the skills and knowledge she would need to successfully lead the initiative that Michael had proposed. The learning curve would be steep, but her clinical experience and recent encounter with institutional injustice provided relevant background for the work ahead. Kelly called regularly to discuss Jessica's decision-making process and offer perspective on the foundation opportunity. As someone who continued working within the hospital system, Kelly understood both the potential impact of Michael's proposal and the challenges that Jessica would face in transitioning from clinical practice to advocacy and policy work. Dr. Patricia Wong also reached out to express her support for the foundation concept and offer her expertise in research and experimental treatment development. The endorsement from the researcher who had provided the compound that saved the twins' lives added credibility to Michael's vision and confidence in Jessica's ability to lead the initiative effectively. When Jessica called Michael a week later to accept his offer, she felt a sense of excitement and purpose that had been missing since her hospital termination. "I want to move forward with the foundation, Michael. I think we can create something that will make a real difference for medical professionals and patients." Michael's enthusiasm was evident as they began planning the foundation's launch and early priorities. The initial focus would include establishing legal advocacy services for medical professionals facing disciplinary action, creating research, funding for experimental treatments with emergency applications, and developing educational programs for healthcare workers about innovative decision-making in crisis situations. The news of Jessica's new role as director of the Parker Foundation for Medical Innovation attracted immediate attention from medical professionals who had followed her story and understood the broader implications of her termination from Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center. Healthcare workers from across the country reached out to share their own experiences with institutional resistance to innovative patient care. Letters and emails poured into the Foundation's preliminary office as medical professionals described similar situations where they had faced consequences for making decisions that prioritized patient outcomes over administrative procedures. Each message reinforced the need for the advocacy and support services that the Foundation was being created to provide. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the emergency department physician who had authorized the experimental treatment, contacted Jessica to express her support for the foundation and offer her assistance with clinical advisory services. Her endorsement carried significant weight within the medical community and helped establish the foundation's credibility among healthcare professionals. The foundation's official launch attracted coverage from medical journals and healthcare trade publications, with stories focusing on the need for institutional support for medical innovation and calculated risk-taking in emergency situations. Jessica found herself interviewed by journalists who understood the significance of her experience and its implications for healthcare policy. National medical organizations began reaching out to explore partnerships with the Parker Foundation for Medical Innovation, recognizing the foundation's potential to address systemic issues that affected their members' ability to provide optimal patient care. The American Nurses Association expressed particular interest in the foundation's advocacy services and legal support programs. Within 6 months of its launch, the foundation had provided legal assistance to over 100 medical professionals, facing disciplinary action for innovative patient care decisions. The success stories began accumulating as healthcare workers received support that enabled them to continue their careers while advocating for policy changes that would protect future innovators. The Foundation's research funding program began supporting experimental treatment studies that could provide emergency applications for conditions like carbon monoxide poisoning, sepsis, and cardiac arrest in pediatric patients. The research initiatives promised to expand the options available to medical professionals facing crisis situations where conventional treatments proved insufficient. Educational programs developed by the foundation reached thousands of healthcare workers through conferences, online training modules, and institutional partnerships with hospitals and medical schools. The programs focused on ethical decision-making in emergency situations and strategies for advocating for policy changes that supported medical innovation. Jessica's transformation from unemployed nurse to national healthcare advocate attracted attention from policymakers who recognized the need for systematic changes in how the medical system approached innovation and emergency decision-making. Congressional hearings on healthcare policy began, including testimony about the importance of protecting medical professionals who took calculated risks to save lives. The Foundation's impact extended beyond individual advocacy cases to influence institutional policies at hospitals throughout the country. Healthcare facilities began revising their experimental treatment protocols to provide faster approval processes for emergency situations while maintaining appropriate safety oversight. Medical schools incorporated foundation-developed curriculum materials into their programs, ensuring that future healthcare professionals understood both the importance of innovative thinking in emergency situations and the institutional supports available to protect them from unfair consequences for patient-focused decision-making. The Parker Foundation for Medical Innovation's annual report documented impressive achievements in its first year of operation, including successful advocacy for over 200 medical professionals, funding for 15 experimental treatment studies, and educational program participation by more than 10,000 healthcare workers. Jessica's keynote address at the National Medical Innovation Conference drew standing ovations from an audience of healthcare professionals who understood the significance of her journey from terminated nurse to national advocate for medical innovation and patient-focused care. The speech that followed would be remembered as a pivotal moment in healthcare policy development, as Jessica articulated a vision for institutional change that prioritized patient outcomes over administrative convenience while maintaining appropriate safety standards and regulatory compliance. Personal recognition came in the form of awards from nursing organizations, medical societies, and patient advocacy groups. But Jessica understood that the Foundation's impact on systematic change represented the true measure of success for the initiative that had grown from her decision to suggest experimental treatment for 2 dying children. The White House invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in spring, nearly 2 years after Jessica's termination from Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center had seemed like the end of her nursing career. The formal request for her presence at a ceremony recognizing healthcare innovation and advocacy carried the official seal of the President's office and represented validation at the highest level of government. Standing in the Rose Garden on a perfect May afternoon, surrounded by other healthcare advocates and policy leaders, Jessica reflected on the journey that had brought her from unemployment and professional uncertainty to recognition as a national leader in medical innovation advocacy. The President's remarks during the ceremony acknowledged the importance of protecting medical professionals who took calculated risks to save lives, and specifically mentioned the Parker Foundation for Medical Innovation as an example of how private initiative could address systemic problems in healthcare delivery. The handshake with the President and the formal recognition of her contributions to healthcare policy reform represented a symbolic completion of Jessica's transformation from a nurse who had been punished for saving lives to a leader who was creating systematic change to prevent similar injustices. Emma and Ethan Parker, now 9 years old and thriving, attended the White House ceremony with their father, their presence serving as a powerful reminder of the human impact that had motivated all of the Foundation's work. The children had grown, taller and more articulate, but they retained the enthusiasm and curiosity that had characterized their personalities before their brush with carbon monoxide poisoning. The Foundation's work continued to expand, with new initiatives addressing emergency medicine protocols, experimental treatment approval processes, and legal protections for healthcare workers who prioritized patient outcomes over administrative procedures. Each program built on the Foundation's core mission of ensuring that medical professionals could focus on saving lives without fear of career-ending consequences. Jessica's personal story had become inseparable from the broader movement toward healthcare policy reform that prioritized patient care and medical innovation. Her experience of being terminated for successfully treating Emma and Ethan Parker had created a platform for addressing systemic issues that affected thousands of medical professionals and countless patients throughout the healthcare system. The Foundation's impact could be measured not only in individual advocacy successes and research funding achievements, but also in the cultural shift within healthcare institutions toward greater support for innovation and calculated risk-taking. In emergency situations, hospitals throughout the country had revised their policies to provide faster approval processes for experimental treatments while maintaining appropriate safety oversight. Medical education programs incorporated Foundation-developed materials that taught future healthcare professionals about the importance of patient-focused decision-making and the institutional supports available to protect them from unfair consequences. For innovative thinking during medical emergencies, the transformation from fired nurse to national healthcare advocate represented more than personal redemption. It demonstrated the potential for individual experiences of injustice to become catalysts for systematic change that could benefit entire professions and the patients they served. As Jessica continued her work, leading the Parker Foundation for Medical Innovation, she maintained contact with colleagues from her hospital nursing career, many of whom had become advocates for the Foundation's mission within their own institutions. The network of healthcare professionals supporting medical innovation and patient-focused care continued to grow, creating momentum for policy changes at local, state, and federal levels. The legacy of Jessica's decision to suggest experimental treatment for two dying children extended far beyond the successful preservation of Emma and Ethan Parker's lives. It had become the foundation for a movement that was transforming how the healthcare system approached innovation, risk-taking, and the protection of medical professionals who prioritized patient outcomes over administrative convenience. Years later, when healthcare historians examined the factors that led to significant improvements in emergency medicine protocols and medical innovation policies, they would trace many of the changes back to a winter night in Denver, when a pediatric nurse suggested using an experimental compound to save two children's lives, lost her job for making that suggestion, and then transformed her experience of injustice into a platform for creating systematic change that benefited countless medical professionals and patients throughout the healthcare system. The story that had begun with carbon monoxide poisoning and protocol violations had evolved into a legacy of advocacy, innovation, and institutional reform that would continue benefiting healthcare delivery for generations to come. The experimental compound flowed through the specialized IV tubing with measured precision, carrying hope into Emma's small bloodstream as Jessica monitored every aspect of the unprecedented treatment. The pediatric intensive care unit had been transformed into something resembling a research laboratory, with additional monitoring equipment crowding around both twins' beds, while Dr. Wong maintained constant supervision of the compound's administration. Jessica felt the weight of medical history unfolding as she watched the green lines on Emma's cardiac monitor begin to show subtle changes that suggested the experimental treatment was interacting with the carbon monoxide poisoning in exactly the way the Johns Hopkins research had predicted. The little girl's breathing appeared less labored despite her continued unconsciousness, and her skin color was gradually returning to a more natural tone. Across the intensive care unit, Kelly was reporting similar observations as Ethan received his carefully calculated dose of the compound. Both twins remained unconscious, but their vital signs were showing the first measurable improvements that the medical team had witnessed since the crisis had escalated beyond conventional treatment protocols. Dr. Vasquez moved between the twins' beds with the focused intensity that characterized emergency physicians managing life-threatening situations where every decision carried enormous consequences. Her experience told her that the experimental compound was performing as hoped, but she also understood that the next several hours would determine whether the protocol violation would result in complete recovery or unexpected complications. The 8-minute administration period required constant vigilance as Jessica adjusted the IV flow rate according to Dr. Wong's precise specifications, while monitoring Emma's cardiac rhythm for any signs of the temporary irregularities that the research had identified as possible side effects. The beeping of multiple monitors created a complex symphony of medical data that told the story of two young lives balanced between recovery and continued danger. Dr. Wong documented every aspect of the experimental treatment with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized medical research, knowing that this emergency application would provide valuable data for future studies of carbon monoxide poisoning interventions. Her research background made her acutely aware that Emma and Ethan's cases could advance understanding of experimental treatments in ways that controlled laboratory studies could never achieve. As the compound administration reached completion, Jessica found herself holding her breath while watching for Emma's initial response to the treatment. The little girl's face remained peaceful in unconsciousness, but her breathing seemed easier and her cardiac rhythm was showing increased stability, compared to the dangerous irregularities that had characterized her condition before the experimental intervention. Kelly's voice carried cautious optimism as she reported on Ethan's condition following his treatment. His oxygen saturation is improving steadily, and the cardiac arrhythmias are becoming less frequent. The compound appears to be facilitating carbon monoxide elimination just as the research predicted. The next hour passed with intense monitoring as both twins' bodies processed the experimental compound and began the complex biological process of eliminating the carbon monoxide that had nearly claimed their lives. Jessica remained at Emma's bedside, watching for any sign that the little girl was responding to the intervention that had required breaking every established protocol. Emma's first sign of neurological improvement came as a slight movement of her fingers, barely perceptible but unmistakable to Jessica's trained eye. The small gesture represented the beginning of what would hopefully be a complete recovery from carbon monoxide poisoning that could have resulted in permanent brain damage or death. Dr. Vasquez noticed the finger movement immediately and began a more comprehensive neurological assessment, checking Emma's reflexes and responses to various stimuli. The preliminary results suggested that the experimental compound was successfully preventing the neurological damage that conventional treatment had been unable to address. Ethan's recovery followed a similar pattern, with gradual improvements in neurological function and continued stabilization of his cardiac rhythm. Both twins remained unconscious, but their vital signs showed consistent progress that indicated the experimental treatment was achieving its intended effects without producing the adverse reactions that everyone had feared. The medical team maintained constant vigilance throughout the night as Emma and Ethan's conditions continued to improve steadily. Jessica found herself documenting every detail of their recovery, understanding that this information would be crucial for future emergency applications of the experimental compound and potentially for defending the decision to use it without proper authorization. By morning, both twins were showing signs of returning consciousness, with Emma occasionally opening her eyes and responding to her name, while Ethan had begun moving voluntarily and attempting to speak, despite his continued confusion and weakness. The experimental treatment had succeeded beyond everyone's most optimistic expectations. Dr. Wong spent the early morning hours reviewing all the data from the twins' treatment, her excitement about the successful application of her research, tempered by awareness that the protocol violation would inevitably trigger administrative review and potential consequences for everyone involved in the decision. Jessica's shift was officially ending as the day staff arrived, but she found herself reluctant to leave Emma and Ethan when their recovery was progressing so remarkably. The little girl had begun asking for her father, and Ethan was showing curiosity about his surroundings that suggested his cognitive function was returning to normal. The successful treatment of the twins represented a triumph for experimental medicine and innovative thinking in emergency situations. But Jessica understood that the celebration would be brief before the hospital administration began investigating the protocol violation and its implications for institutional liability. Kelly joined Jessica as they prepared to leave the intensive care unit after ensuring that the day shift was fully briefed on the twins' condition and the experimental treatment they had received. "You saved their lives, Jessica. Whatever happens with the administration, Emma and Ethan are alive because you remembered the research and had the courage to suggest using it." The walk through the hospital corridors felt different as Jessica made her way toward the exit, carrying the satisfaction of successful patient care, but also the growing apprehension about the professional consequences that would likely follow. The twins were recovering, but the protocol violation would not be forgotten or overlooked by hospital administrators focused on regulatory compliance. Outside the hospital, the Denver morning was crisp and clear with the previous night's snow, creating a pristine landscape that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the medical crisis that had unfolded in the intensive care unit. Jessica drove home through quiet streets, processing the events of the night and trying to prepare mentally for whatever administrative review would follow. Her apartment felt like a refuge after the intensity of the experimental treatment and the emotional toll of watching two young lives hang in the balance. Jessica made herself coffee and settled into her favorite chair, finally allowing herself to feel the full impact of what had been accomplished during the night. The twins were alive and recovering because she had remembered research about an experimental compound and had the courage to suggest its use when conventional treatment was failing. The decision had required breaking established protocols and risking her career, but Emma and Ethan Parker would grow up to experience all the joys and challenges of childhood because of that choice. Jessica's phone buzzed with a text message from Kelly, providing an update on the twins' continued improvement. Both children were now fully conscious and asking questions about what had happened to them, their cognitive function apparently unaffected by the carbon monoxide poisoning that could have caused permanent brain damage. The next few days passed quietly as Jessica waited for the inevitable call from hospital administration requesting her presence at a meeting to discuss the experimental treatment incident. She used the time to research the legal and professional implications of protocol violations in emergency medical situations, trying to understand what consequences she might face. Dr. Wong called to thank Jessica for her role in the successful application of the experimental compound and to inform her that the twins' recovery was providing valuable data for the ongoing research study. The children's cases would likely contribute to faster approval processes for the compound and potentially save countless lives in future carbon monoxide poisoning emergencies. When the call from hospital administration finally came, Jessica felt prepared for whatever disciplinary action would follow. She had saved two children's lives using the best medical knowledge available, and she felt no regret about the decision despite its potential impact on her career. The administrative meeting proceeded exactly as Jessica had anticipated, with institutional priorities taking precedence over successful patient outcomes. The hospital's focus on regulatory compliance and liability protection made her termination inevitable, regardless of the twins' remarkable recovery. Jessica left Rocky Mountain Children's Medical Center for the final time, carrying her personal belongings and the knowledge that she had made the right decision under impossible circumstances. The twins were alive and healthy, and that outcome justified every professional consequence that followed. The weeks of unemployment and job searching that followed felt surreal after 8 years of dedicated service to pediatric patients. Jessica found herself explaining her termination to potential employers who seemed more concerned about protocol violations than successful life-saving interventions. The unexpected visit from Michael Parker transformed Jessica's understanding of her situation and opened possibilities that she had never imagined during the darkest moments of unemployment and career uncertainty. The father of the children she had helped save possessed both the resources and motivation to address the systemic injustice that had resulted from her courageous decision. Michael's proposal for the Parker Foundation for Medical Innovation represented more than personal redemption. It offered the opportunity to create systematic change that could prevent other medical professionals from facing similar consequences for prioritizing patient care over administrative procedures. The foundation's rapid growth and impact exceeded everyone's expectations, as healthcare workers throughout the country shared their own experiences with institutional resistance to innovative patient care. Jessica found herself leading a movement that was transforming how the medical system approached emergency decision-making and professional protection. Legal advocacy services provided by the foundation helped hundreds of medical professionals facing disciplinary action for patient-focused decisions, while research funding supported studies of experimental treatments that could benefit emergency medicine. Educational programs reached thousands of healthcare workers with training about ethical decision-making in crisis situations. The Foundation's influence extended to policy development at institutional and governmental levels, with hospitals revising their experimental treatment protocols and legislators considering legal protections for healthcare workers who took calculated risks to save lives. Jessica's transformation from terminated nurse to national healthcare advocate attracted recognition from medical organizations, policymakers, and patient advocacy groups who understood the significance of her journey and its implications for healthcare delivery throughout the system. The White House ceremony that formally recognized Jessica's contributions to healthcare innovation and advocacy represented validation at the highest level of government, with the president acknowledging the importance of protecting medical professionals who prioritized patient outcomes over administrative convenience. Emma and Ethan Parker's presence at the ceremony served as powerful reminders of the human impact that had motivated all of the Foundation's work. The children, now healthy and thriving, represented the countless lives that could be saved when medical professionals were empowered to make innovative decisions without fear of career-ending consequences. The Foundation's continuing work addressed emergency medicine protocols, experimental treatment approval processes, and institutional support for healthcare innovation, building on the core mission of ensuring that patient care remained the primary focus of medical decision-making. Years after the carbon monoxide poisoning incident that had threatened to end 2 young lives and had actually ended Jessica's hospital career, the ripple effects continued to transform healthcare delivery throughout the country. Hospital policies had been revised, medical education had been enhanced, and thousands of healthcare workers had received support for innovative patient care decisions. The experimental compound that had saved Emma and Ethan's lives received full FDA approval for emergency use in carbon monoxide poisoning cases, making it available to medical professionals facing similar crises without requiring protocol violations. The research data from the twins' treatment had been instrumental in demonstrating the compound's safety and effectiveness. Medical schools incorporated Foundation-developed curriculum materials that taught future healthcare professionals about the importance of patient-focused decision-making and the institutional supports available to protect them from unfair consequences. For innovative thinking during emergencies, the cultural shift within healthcare institutions toward greater support for medical innovation could be traced directly to the Foundation's advocacy work and the powerful example of Jessica's journey. From professional punishment to national recognition for healthcare leadership, Jessica's story had become a touchstone for discussions about medical ethics, emergency decision-making, and the protection of healthcare workers who faced impossible choices between following rules and saving lives. Her experience demonstrated that individual courage in the face of institutional injustice could create lasting change that benefited entire professions. The Parker Foundation for Medical Innovation continued to expand its impact through new initiatives addressing medical research funding, policy advocacy, and educational programs that reached healthcare workers throughout the country and internationally. The Foundation's work represented a living legacy of the decision to suggest experimental treatment for 2 dying children. Emma and Ethan Parker grew up understanding that their lives had been saved through innovative medical thinking, and that their recovery had created opportunities for systematic improvements in healthcare delivery. Their annual visits to the Foundation served as reminders of the human impact that motivated all of the organization's work. The transformation of a winter night medical emergency into a national movement for healthcare reform demonstrated the potential for individual experiences of injustice to become catalysts for positive change that extended far beyond personal redemption to benefit countless others facing similar challenges. Healthcare historians would later identify Jessica's case as a pivotal moment in the evolution of emergency medicine protocols and medical innovation policies, marking the beginning of significant improvements in how the healthcare system balanced regulatory compliance with patient-focused care and professional protection for innovative thinking. The legacy of the experimental compound administration that had saved 2 children's lives continued to influence medical practice, policy development, and professional education long after the immediate crisis had passed, creating lasting improvements in healthcare delivery that would benefit patients and medical professionals for generations to come. Jessica's journey from fired nurse to national healthcare advocate represented more than personal triumph over professional adversity. It demonstrated the power of courage, innovation, and determination to create meaningful change in complex systems that too often prioritized institutional protection over the fundamental mission of saving lives and promoting healing. The story that had begun with carbon monoxide poisoning and protocol violations had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how the healthcare system approached emergency decision-making, medical innovation, and the protection of professionals who prioritized patient outcomes over administrative convenience, creating a lasting impact that would continue benefiting healthcare delivery for decades to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.